All right. And we are in the middle of a lecture series, right? The lecture series I've titled "Alone Together in the Pandemic: What Becomes of Humanity When Most of Life Transpires Online." And I'm gonna do what I said I would do at the outset, which is kind of move back and forth between contemporary politics and that topic, which has a lot to do with contemporary politics, but is also obviously focusing on themes beyond contemporary politics. And today I'm going to pose a big question. And in a sense, it's one of the motivating questions for this lecture series. Can democracy survive if we do not regulate social media? And I started with a longer title: if we do not develop the capacity to regulate social media, if we do not figure out how to regulate social media. I want to be clear. I don't have the silver bullet answer for how to regulate social media. But I think what the events of the last 10 days and the last 4 years, really perhaps the last decade, should make clear to us is that if we don't figure out how to do this, we may be in deep trouble. And the kind of trouble that frankly threatens the viability of democracy, right? And so I've shared with you before, my bookcase behind me has a whole shelf full of books on is democracy dying? How does democracy end? Is democracy diminished, et cetera, and so on, right? And I think what has become clear, right, that there are a number of factors that are deforming and diminishing democracy as we enter the third decade of the 21st century. But social media are dissociating a significant portion of the citizenry of the United States and of many other societies as well from reality, getting them to buy into fantasies, big lies, alternative realities. And democracy does not function well, and demagogues see all kinds of openings and opportunities when a significant portion of the population is so dissociated from the truth or from reality that we cannot construct a common narrative of the issues we face. And so I'm not telling you how to regulate social media. I don't have the answer to that. That will take a sustained, serious conversation with people with much greater expertise than me. Unless and until we figure it out, democracy is in danger. All right, so what I want to start with today, and as I say, I'll move back and forth between contemporary politics and issues to do with the way in which our technology and media are changing us. I want to start, and I probably will spend a fair bit of time taking stock of where we are. And where we are, as somebody commented at the beginning, as you know, Thursday will be the dawn of a new administration, Wednesday afternoon to be precise, right? And we are entering what I would call the most peculiar presidential transition in living memory. It's peculiar in part because the outgoing president doesn't acknowledge the legitimacy of the outcome of the election, and so of the incoming president, and has made it abundantly clear to his followers that he is not willing to participate in the normal rituals of transition. Far from it. He, in fact, is trying to undermine the transition. He will not be there for the inauguration. He has not participated in any of the niceties or any of the essential routines, administrative routines of passing information and authority to the next administration. And in fact, as we saw on January 6th, and I do think, and in a sense, I hope that January 6th, 2021 will become the kind of common referent that September 11th, 2001 was and maybe is still for many of us a couple decades later, right? Which is to say, a date that symbolizes a major assault on the country and a major transition in our understanding of what it takes to sustain our society, right? And so on January 6, 2021, the President of the United States incited a mob that then laid siege to Congress in order to disrupt and uh, eventually the hope was overturn the certification of the outcomes of the 2020 presidential election. And I don't want to concentrate on that event today. I will talk a little bit more about it, but I do want to suggest to you that this is the logical culmination of the Trump presidency, and that by analyzing this event, we can also see a lot into the most salient features of Trump's 4 years in office, and that it's appropriate to do this as this week we mark the end of his presidency. And so let me just start with a list of what I think the most salient features of Trump's presidency have been, and the way in which they relate to what we saw on Wednesday, January 6th. The first is fairly obvious: the fierce and complete loyalty of Trump's followers. And you may remember during the campaign, Trump famously said he could shoot a man on Fifth Avenue and he wouldn't lose any support, right? And this, as it turns out, was quite accurate. Not entirely accurate. Trump did, in fact, lose support over his 4 years in the presidency, and that is why he was not reelected, right? Which is to say, a certain number of voters were repelled by the white ethnonationalism, the anti-immigration policy, the separation of children from their families at the border, the failure to condemn the white supremacist rioters in Charlottesville, right? The way in which Trump polarized the nation and seemed to revel in dividing us as opposed to unifying us. And so I want to call this Trump's polarizing charisma. And I want to be clear about why I'm using that terminology, right? On the one hand, it is quite clear that Trump is a uniquely charismatic figure. And that probably cannot be separated from other aspects of his personality, many of which made him ill-suited to be a successful president. But the way in which he conducts himself, the way in which he embodies a kind of sheer willfulness, his total disregard for norms and institutions, this made him a compelling figure for a significant portion of the population of the United States, who saw in him for the first time in a long time a leader that they thought, in a sense, shared their disdain and alienation from the elite culture of the United States. And this is a tricky line to walk, to be a billionaire and the president of the United States and yet embody alienation from elite culture. Trump pulled that off. And I do think that suggests, in a sense, the source of his unique charisma and why it is going to be very difficult for Mike Pence or Ted Cruz or others who aspire to be the next Trump to pull this off, right? Which is to say, at some level, it is this unique combination that Trump has of being elite and at the same time embodying complete hostility to elite culture that I think is going to be very difficult for others to reproduce. And so when we ask, why is it that thousands of people were willing to participate in a riot, a siege on a central institution of American democracy, when the consequence of doing so is likely to be that they will be prosecuted and convicted and jailed? We have to look at that loyalty of his followers and recognize that this is perhaps a unique movement, and that it is very difficult to disassociate from the man himself, Donald J. Trump. Now, having said that, I do want to also suggest that there are other aspects of the last 4 years and the last 10 days that suggest that we're not simply going to close the door on the era of Trump in American politics, and that in a sense that is irrespective of what actually happens to Donald Trump. And there is evidence that he is potentially in a lot of trouble legally, financially, in terms of his capacity to communicate with his followers, to generate new revenue, to avoid legal liability once he is no longer president, right? And so it may be that the next few years will in fact be very difficult for Donald Trump, and that he will not be able to sustain his leadership in the movement he founded. But having said all of that, I do think that he has launched a new era in American politics, and we will have to see what direction we end up going in the aftermath or wake of Trump's presidency. Second big thing I think we, in a sense, take away from January 6, 2021, and that is the degree to which the Republican Party has become the party of Trump. And so, right, the fact that after the siege on the Capitol, after a mob descended to do apparent violence to not only the Democrat, but some of the Republican leadership of Congress, nevertheless, the majority of the House Republican caucus voted to overturn the electoral results that they have to know are valid, are rooted in fair and accurate processes that have been confirmed and reconfirmed by Republican officials, by Republican appointed judges, that there is nothing to the myth that the election was stolen other than a publicity ploy on the part of ambitious officials to keep their power or enlarge it, right? And yet, even after the siege, the majority of the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives voted not to certify the election results from Arizona and Pennsylvania. And this should indicate then the degree to which, especially in the House of Representatives, but also at the grassroots level, the Republican Party has now a Trump constituency. It's not all Republicans, and I think we have to be clear about that. But the electoral calculus behind this is absolutely clear. The Republican Party is a minority party in the United States. It cannot attract much of the most important categories of growing demographics: people of color, people who live in urban areas, younger people. They vote in very small numbers for Republicans. They vote dominantly for Democrats or not at all, right? And so if the Republican Party is to maintain electoral viability, it has to mobilize a minority of voters to outvote the majority. And Trump has the charisma, the appeal, the almost fanatical devotion to do that, and the uh, path to electoral victory for Republicans if they completely disavow Trump's electoral catnip does not seem to be there, right? And so the reason the Republican Party has become and likely will remain the party of Trump is structural. It's rooted to an electoral calculus that, in a sense, does not favor the Republican Party. This is part and parcel of the same calculus that led the Republicans to engage in gerrymandering and voter suppression in much greater degrees than the Democrats have in recent years. And so I think we just have to be clear about why Trump has so much power over his party, even in the aftermath of one of the most abysmal spectacles in recent American politics. Third aspect of this, again, looking at the way in which January 6th illustrates deep structural features of the Trump presidency and of contemporary American politics. Trump was an autocratic president, right? You might call him authoritarian in terms of his personality. He wanted to use executive power as the sole basis for ruling our society. And he therefore did not recognize the limits of his office. He was clear and public in declaring that he thought that his office allowed him to do very much unilaterally. And of course, this is not the constitutional design of the United States of America, right? We have checks and balances. We were founded by people with deep distrust of autocratic executives, right? Because we fought a revolution against a king who refused to even listen to our petitions, right? And so he was, in a sense, at war with the structure of his office, the structure of American institutions, and he continued to try to aggrandize the power of the presidency up to the point of actually trying to overturn the outcome of an election, right? And so this is a third feature of the Trump presidency that I think as we take task, we have to think carefully about. How is it that we elected an autocratic president? How successfully did we check his desire to abuse the powers vested in his office? How much did we fail to do that? And I think, in a sense, when we turn to impeachment in a few minutes, those are the kinds of questions we need to be thinking about as we evaluate the fact that Trump has now been impeached for a second time, and as in the not too distant future, the Senate will begin a trial to determine whether he should be convicted. Fourth aspect, and now that these things are connected to each other, these aspects of Trump's presidency, Trump claimed not only autocratic political power, but exclusive authority that was political and epistemic. And by epistemic, I mean that the authority to tell us what reality is, what knowledge is, and in particular, to dismiss other sources of knowledge, right? To tell his followers that the mainstream press and broadcast news are fake news and not to be listened to. That if something turned out in a way that didn't favor him, if he lost an election, that was because of fraud and theft, right? And this is the biggest of the big lies. But it's worthwhile noting that Donald Trump's presidency, or I should say his foray into politics, began with an obvious lie in which he asserted, you should listen to me and not pay attention to public documents, not pay attention to the mainstream media. That was, of course, the birther movement, the effort to convince his followers that Barack Obama was born in Kenya, notwithstanding all the evidence that was available for the fact that he was clearly not born there, but born in the United States. And please note, right, the way in which this then contributes to the next feature of his presidency, which is his white ethno-nationalism. And I want to be clear about the vocabulary here. I've thrown that term around a fair bit recently, and I want to explain what I'm saying, right? Ethno-nationalism, particularly in a democracy, is the claim that the people, the demos, form a nation, right? That is to say that they are part of an integrated political community that has care and solidarity in its borders for its members. And that what makes the nation a nation, what makes it that kind of integrated solidaristic community, is the fact that everyone in the nation shares the same ethnic identity, right? And this has been quite typical of European democratic and nationalist politics for much of the 20th century. It's become a bit more problematic in the 21st century as Europe has diversified, but it's still alive and well in many European societies. We can look at Hungary and Poland for clear current examples. And on the other hand, it was not that common in the United States for important periods in American history, because the United States, unlike European countries, is an immigrant society, right? And so if you tried to identify the ethnicity of the United States, you might say it's an Anglo country, it's a British country, Anglo-European, some people say, but you know, the fact of the matter is, whether we're talking about the Irish or the Italians or the Germans, right? We could keep going, the Greeks, the Jews, etc. There are a whole bunch of people who do not fit very neatly into any singular ethnic identity. But in a sense, whiteness serves as a surrogate for ethnicity in efforts to forge an American white ethno-national identity. And what Trump has done is to take white ethno-nationalism, which was dormant, I guess, maybe for much of the last 50 years, at least not explicitly invoked, sometimes dog whistled by previous presidents, and brought it out into the clear light of day. And again, this is part of his charisma, is his unapologetic willingness to play the card of white ethno-nationalism. And it's part of his populism as well. And populism, again, I want to try to define it as clearly as possible, suggests on the one hand that the people deserve to be represented by a leader who is like them, identifies with them, gets them, and truly represents them. And in saying that, populist demagogues tend to say there is only one true people to the country, right? And that people is uniform and unified around ideas, and those ideas are the ideas I represent. So it's a neat path to legitimacy. I represent the true will of the true people of my country. And it tends then to evoke a unified people, right? And white ethno-nationalism essentially suggests, right, that there's one true way to be an American, and that all of these other people, African Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans, and the urban elite who want to welcome them and to embrace diversity, are not truly American, are not truly part of the people. And that this, right, move in politics is, I think, what was repudiated in the election of 2020, not by 70 plus million people who voted for Donald Trump, more people than voted for any other president in the history of the United States, except for Joe Biden. But the fact that millions more voted for Joe Biden means that millions, for a variety of reasons, some of which have to do with the fact that the ethno-nationalist populism of Donald Trump repelled, nauseated, angered them, right? And so the fact that this way of thinking about America was repudiated by the majority of Americans runs headlong into the fact that the white ethno-nationalist populism of Donald Trump repudiates the legitimacy of those people. I'm sorry, I'm making this more complicated than it needs to be, right? Donald Trump is saying that those who didn't vote for him are illegitimate, right? And he's saying it in an unsubtle way. Let's be careful to look at the votes of Detroit and Philadelphia, right? Let's look at cities that are majority Black or very pluralistic carefully, because there must have been a lot of fraud there. And if we discount those cities and those voters, then I won the election. And look at how neatly that fits with the white ethno-nationalist populist narrative of what America is and who Trump represents. And so the idea that the vote was stolen very much flows out of the way in which Donald Trump sold himself in the first place as the leader of the true America, the America that needs to be restored, make America great again, which was an America that was dominantly white, in which white people were unapologetically the source of political and social power. Now, the next aspect of this, and the one that ties most firmly into the overall lecture series, is that this was a social media presidency, right? Donald Trump won because of Twitter. He was very explicit about this as well. He used new media, social media, Facebook and especially Twitter, to direct the attention of old-fashioned media, of broadcast media. Part of the story of the 2020 election that we're not focused enough on because of the failure of Donald Trump to accept the outcome of the election and his ability to mobilize his followers to resist the outcome of the election, is that the mainstream media did better in 2020. In certain respects, social media did better in 2020 as well. Certainly not well enough, but the mainstream media did much better in not allowing Donald Trump and his campaign to use social media to direct what they were paying attention to, right? One of the things that the people who come out of the White House tell us is how fascinated Donald Trump is with his capacity to issue a tweet and using that tweet direct the news, CNN and Fox and MSNBC and the New York Times, to pay attention to whatever he just said, right? And so Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016 in large part because he mastered new media technology and because his adversaries did not have the same mastery of it. And then he governed using that same technology, that same media, right? And he used tweets as if they were executive decrees, right? To try to announce new policy, to fire his aides or even cabinet members, etc., right? And I just want to point out for a moment that one of the things that we know when we study history is that moments of transition in the media of communication are often moments of political instability and transition as well. When the media change, the way in which we communicate and the way in which we construct our knowledge changes. And that has the potential to disrupt society because, of course, the way in which society is reproduced is through socializing subsequent generations through communication and the transmission of knowledge. When you disrupt those aspects of social reproduction, you destabilize society as a whole. And in ways that I will get into later in this lecture series, this new technology in particular is highly disruptive and frankly dangerous. And that's in part because it is a many to many technology. It lets anybody who has a computer, has a phone, produce media content. And for most of the modern era of human history, that has not been the case, right? That is to say, control over media has been restricted to a relatively select few, and depending upon their orientation, their values, they have determined what can and cannot be published in a way that allows it to reach a broad public. Social media breaks that bottleneck and those filters and allows, as Donald Trump likes to say, anybody in their basement to make something that reaches potentially a broad audience. In addition to that, it allows for anonymity, right? So you can produce your knowledge without it being held accountable for having produced it. It allows a kind of distancing, right? That the people making the media content may be on the other side of the world, may be thousands of miles away, have no direct relationship to those receiving the news. And we'll get into this, that the networking itself, the way in which at incredibly rapid speed news can spread from an obscure dark corner of the web to the mainstream, from a few hundred people to hundreds of millions of people. All of this has been incredibly disruptive. And the presidency of Donald Trump took advantage of both this new media technology and of the disruptive effects that it had, and of the fact that the rest of us had not yet figured out how to deal with the new technology and the new disruption. That's part of the story, I think, of 2020, is that mainstream media began to learn how to not get their content hijacked by what was transpiring on social media to the same degree that they had in 2016. Another closely related aspect of this, and I'm sure you're feeling it this week, I certainly am, is the drinking from the fire hose aspect of this, which is to say, the rate at which new information was produced, new scandals arose, has been so rapid that it has been overwhelming, right? And there is a strategy here. And again, it's a kind of brave, almost genius strategy that Donald Trump adopted, which is to say, if there is a scandal, if there is bad news in the news cycle, as opposed to trying to address that scandal, as opposed to trying to counter it or diffuse it, why not overwhelm it with more information, with more scandal, to get to the point where the people who are viewing the news are so exhausted and disoriented that they do not focus on the thing that might be most damaging to you, or they do not focus on any of it, right? And so this has been a period of a sustained 4-year period of tremendously accelerated information transmission. And the result is that many of us just feel kind of shocked and exhausted by it all. And that prevents us from focusing on any aspect of it, of differentiating what is trivial from what is significant, and of digesting and acting on the implications of what is significant. So again, another very important feature of the Trump presidency, and why, in part, I suggest at the outset that I do hope that January 6, 2021 will become a landmark date, a pivot, a turning point, a watershed, that we don't just move on to the next and the next and the next and the next piece of information or date or scandal, that we say, wait a sec, this is an event that is unprecedented in American history, a direct danger to American democracy, and a kind of opportunity to synthesize and reflect on everything that has happened the last 4 years. Let's hold on to January 6, 2021, and figure out what we need to do to protect ourselves from the radicalized domestic terrorists who attacked Congress, but much more deeply still, the social and media changes that produced, motivated, allowed them to act in the way that they did. Final thing I think that we see if we're reflecting on Trump in light of January 6, 2021, is the limits of the man, right? And I want to start with his lack of realism. In the philosophical literature on authoritarianism and fascism, Carl Schmitt, who's a great fascist philosopher, a great German philosopher and theorist, and among the things that Schmitt theorized was the human mind and the capacities of the human mind that liberals tend to focus on, and here the central idea is the understanding and reason, right? That we use our understanding to try to come up with an accurate picture of the world, and then we reason about the implications of that understanding for our action in the world. And Schmitt said, and as opposed to that, those who are not liberal tend to focus on the will, right? On the capacity to act, to decide, to choose, not to passively understand the world and let the world work on us, but to decide how we want the world to be, and then to make the world be that way. And the Trump is certainly an incredibly willful individual. And at the same time, I think he has, to a very high degree, something that even Schmitt would not endorse, which is a total lack of realism, right? And so the idea, which clearly was embraced by Trump, which was encouraged and organized by him on social media, come to Washington on January 6th, and big things will happen on that day, right? That somehow he was going to overturn the outcome of an election that clearly he had lost, that had been certified, audited, recertified, and then registered in the Electoral College, right? Speaks to the idea of an autocratic president who thinks his office has limitless power, but also his lack of realism, right? And the idea that somehow these people were going to storm Congress and disrupt the outcome of the Electoral College being registered, and then change the outcome of the election, was total fantasy. But we're living in a historical moment where we can elect a president to the United States who lacks the basic capacity for reality testing, and a significant portion of our population, his followers, join him in substituting fantasy for reality. I think we really need to reckon with this. And this is, again, deeply connected with the social media world, the way in which knowledge is produced in our moment and untethered, unmoored from reality testing. We had the president who completely embodied our loss of reality testing in our knowledge infrastructure, in the second and third decades of the 21st century. Another aspect of the limitations of the man, his sheer mendacity. There is not, I believe, another leader in human history who has told as many lies as Donald Trump. Certainly, if you use a metric, lies over time, right? You know, Donald Trump told more lies per day, per hour, per week, per year than practically any other person in human history, right? Had absolutely no concern with the truth and was willing to lie to his followers on the assumption that because of their loyalty and devotion, because he would be reinforced by the social media environment in which we live, that he could impose his will via his lies on reality. And we'll get to this in a moment, but as I think more about impeachment, and I'm still not mind made up about it, but as I think more about impeachment, the perhaps singular impeachable offense that Trump committed is not inciting the mob directly, right? Speaking on January 6th, a mile from Congress and telling them to march on Congress and fight like hell, to be strong, etc., tweeting out that Pence had betrayed him. It is the way in which he laid the groundwork for this over years by casting doubt on the reliability of the American electoral system and then repeatedly lying about the outcomes of the 2020 election. That's the not proximate, but long-term, deep cause of what happened on January 6th. And it's a fundamental attribute of Trump and his presidency. Absolutely no concern for the truth, a bold and unrestricted willingness to lie and lie repeatedly. Self-absorption and distraction, right? The idea that sticks with me here is that when Trump took his first trip to Europe in 2017 around the NATO anniversary, that European leaders like Angela Merkel were told that you could only speak to Trump for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, that was the extent of his attention span, right? And what we've come to see is that the one topic he can actually pay attention to is himself. And so we're getting the reports, right, that as the mob descended upon the Capitol, as police officers were being dragged through the street, kicked, beaten, as it turns out, murdered, as the crowd was making its way into Congress with its sights set on the vice president, Trump's loyal companion, right, throughout this journey, on other members of the Republican leadership, his staff could not get Donald Trump's attention in order to get him to try to defuse the crisis because he was so compelled in watching it on TV, so fascinated with his own power to motivate his followers, so apparently wed to the delusion that this might succeed in overturning the election, right? And so again, the fact that we can have this kind of president in 2020 is, I think, something extremely important to be reflecting on. Now, having said all of that, I want to point out that over the last week, right, since we last spoke, we've learned more about what transpired on January 6, 2021. We've learned, among other things, that at least elements of the mob were, in fact, not at all a mob. They were well organized. They were well funded. They were acting on a coordinated strategy. They probably had done some reconnaissance, figured out the weak points, figured out a strategy for how to breach the Capitol, how to get into Congress, and they thought, and here we can talk about QAnon for a moment, and I'm sorry, I think many of you at this point know what I'm referring to, but this is an online group that believes that there is somebody named QAnon, right? That's obviously their pseudonym that they use in order to protect their anonymity, um, who is documenting the fact that Donald Trump is fighting a battle against the deep state, that the deep state is not just the usual bureaucratic administrative inertia that resists a new president doing what he wants, but a deep cabal that is engaged in child trafficking and other terrible things, using state power in order to feed their own predatory corruption, right? And that QAnon tells us that there would be a big uprising, and that the big uprising would in fact overturn the deep state and install Donald Trump in a position of true power. Apparently, some of the people who were well funded and well organized in implementing something like a military strategy in trying to breach the Capitol believe that this was that event, right? The event in which the deep state would be overthrown, and that the result of this would not just be that the outcome of the election would be altered and we get 4 more years of Trump, but that it would be an unbridled and finally empowered Trump as a result of this overthrow. And so we've learned more about the motivation, more about the funding, more about the organization of at least portions of the crowd that participated in this. We've learned more about what Donald Trump was doing in the critical hours of the afternoon of January 6, 2021, when a mob he riled up and inspired was threatening the life of his own vice president. This news was meant for Pence, according to the people who hung it. And that he was not at first willing to do anything to get this mob under control, that he only reluctantly agreed after having been badgered by many of his close advisors, by his son-in-law, by his daughter, to issue some half-hearted tweets to try to get them to stand down, but that he was frankly more fascinated with what was occurring than he was concerned about the well-being of the senators he had worked very closely with for 4 years, his own vice president, or a core institution of American democracy. Third, and again, this is a theme that we're going to have to return to, but what we've learned more and more about is that his followers have been radicalized by a media ecosystem that is completely unmoored from reality and responsibility. And this is not some obscure corner of the dark web. This is Facebook. This is Twitter. This is Instagram. This is YouTube. This is other social media outlets that hide in plain sight, that when we trace the people who engaged in this and their online presence, we see very clearly. And I want to be clear on the language here. In the aftermath of September 11th, 2001, or in the aftermath of the rise of ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, and their capacity to recruit people from Europe and the United States to join them, we asked again and again, how did these people become radicalized? And again, we pointed to social media and its role in radicalizing people into Islamicist fundamentalism. And I think something similar is happening in the United States today. It's much more mainstream, it's much more widespread. It is leading people into an alternative reality in which they believe that fundamental institutions of democracy are deeply corrupted, not the way that you and I would maintain, right? Captured by moneyed interest, but part of that cabal that engages in child sex trafficking, right? That just stuff that's total fantasy, cuckoo stuff is being disseminated and believed, and people are acting on it. The New York Times technology writer says, at this point, almost everybody knows somebody who believes this. And I will tell you, I don't just know people who believe this, I know people who have PhDs from America's most elite institutions that believe this. And so we should be careful to think that we can immunize ourselves against radicalization in this media environment. And that takes me back to the question that I started the lecture with: can democracy survive if we don't regulate social media? And I don't believe democracy can survive if a significant portion of the population is weaponized against democracy by false beliefs propagated on social media. And so again, this is something we're learning about what happened on Wednesday, January 6, 2021. It's why I think we need to be paying so much attention to that date and these events. And it's why I think ultimately democracy requires the regulation of social media. Another aspect of this is that white supremacy was on unapologetic display. And right, you can look at the Anti-Defamation League or the Southern Poverty Research Center to discover that Pepe Le Frog, right, I guess a Disney or Warner Brothers obscure character, has somehow or other become symbolic of white supremacy or white nationalism, right? And obviously we saw Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts and the Confederate flag. So the more we look, the more we see the symbolism of white supremacy, the more we look online into the discourse and chatter surrounding these events, the more we see that white supremacists, some of the very same people who were involved in the Charlottesville white power fiasco in 2017, were there in 2021 at the Capitol. Finally, and this is a question, how many people in this country sympathize with what occurred on January 6, 2021? And again, I think, to be clear, the majority of us are clearly repelled by this, frightened by this, angered by this. But if there is a substantial minority that has sympathy with this, if there's a substantial minority that believes that the vote was stolen from Donald Trump and that what Congress was doing on January 6, 2021 was trying to consolidate the coup that Joe Biden had brought about via stealing the election, never mind that that's totally implausible to believe. If it is believed by significant portions of the American population, then what the crowd did on January 6, 2021 was to try to prevent that theft, right? And so it's not accidental that it was a Stop the Steal rally that marched on the Capitol and brought this about. All right, so I had more to say to you, considerably more, but I managed to talk an awful lot about those events. Let me stop there and ask if you have questions. I'm going to unmute everybody, which means that background noise will pick up, so try to be sensitive to that. Who wants to start us out with a question or a thought today? Go ahead, Flossie. You'll have to hold your spacebar down, right?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, just fine.
Thank you. I want to bring up the question of what I consider one of the opiates that keep us from understanding what is really happening. I watch TV more than I observe Twitter. And the commercials keep going on. We have as many as, let's say we have an hour's time for an MSNBC or CNN. At least 40 minutes of that time goes to commercials. And the commercials spread a kind of velvet screen over what we're listening to. It was only on the 6th that the commercials ceased for a moment and we could see that mob. And now we've gone back to this, things can't be so bad if we're still worried about, well, Subarus versus Volvos, lipsticks versus creams. If we're going to do something about the social media, I think we have to do something about radio, television, and also the internet being dominated by people who want to sell you something that has nothing to do with what's happening in the real world.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Flossie. And I'll just point out to you that one of my favorite contemporary media critics, a man named Robert McChesney, who's written a whole bunch of stuff, but the book, the title of which I like most and that really established him is Rich Media, Poor Democracy. And in that book, he suggests that we should have on our tax returns maybe a voluntary, maybe a mandatory media contribution box, right? And so that if everybody, in the same way that you contribute to funding political elections, contributed $5 to media, and if then you maybe later in the year got some input into which media outlets you wanted your public contribution to go to, we could begin to build a more robust public media system and begin to sustain alternative media that are less commercially dependent than is almost everything we watch on TV right now. And I'll just point out to you, if you've spent any time in Britain, right, where they've got the BBC, where they've got a robust public media system, you will notice when you go over to ITV, to commercial television, much less advertising than you see in the United States. And the reason is because people are used to good public media that has no advertising. They just won't put up with the constant disruption that advertisement is in the United States, right? And so there are things that we could be doing structurally to address this. I want to be clear then at a deeper level why we should be concerned about this. And I spoke with you last week about Jürgen Habermas and his book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, and the lesson that I wanted us to draw from it, which it's an enormously complex book, but last week had to do with the fact that the ethics, values, orientation of those who own and produce our media content determine to a large degree the quality of that content. And we are in an era of profiteering on our media. And I want to be clear, I think it's actually worse in the social media sphere, which really don't have nearly as much or nearly as obvious advertising, right? Because they're harvesting our data, right? Our information, and they're selling it to the advertisers to then do targeted advertising, right? And so this is, I think, a very important theme, which is not just about all the commercials. It's about the commercial orientation of those who produce media and what that does to the content of the media. So yes, Flossie, thank you for raising that theme. Caroline, were you raising your hand? I couldn't tell.
No.
No? Okay. Okay. Well then, John Sutter, you are, right? Go ahead.
Yeah. I wonder, your idea of regulating social media, is the cure worse than the disease? And also, how do other countries deal with this? But we would have to create a bureaucracy which censors social media. And of course, that has a lot of problems in and of itself. And
So,
it's very hard to get, how do you get neutrality without, it could become a worse, it could become worse than our current situation.
so thank you for the question, John. And I want to be direct and honest. I don't have a policy proposal in place. And I'm going to do some more research as I continue with this lecture series and see if there aren't some good policies out there or some good policy proposals out there. But having said that, I think we need 21st century solutions for 21st century problems. Let me start with an analogy. And this is something some of you may remember, and the history is quite clear. In the early 1960s, as the evidence mounted that cigarette smoking was not in fact harmless, but tremendously harmful, that you were putting a carcinogen into a central organ of your body, the big tobacco manufacturers said, first of all, let us regulate ourselves. And second of all, the cure is worse than the disease. This is the path to socialism. And in the end, right, we passed regulations on the tobacco industry that required filtering and regulating the access and advertising the danger. And the result is that a lot fewer people smoke than they did 50 years ago, that there's a lot less secondhand smoke. There's a lot more regulations around where you can smoke. And guess what? Capitalism did not go down the drain as a result of regulating big tobacco. So there are ways to regulate that sometimes overcome the obstacles. Now, having said that, let's get more specific for a moment. I don't think what we're talking about, if we're talking about regulating social media, is creating a centralized governmental bureaucracy that looks at everything on social media and determines what can actually be aired and what can't be aired, right? That would be incompatible with the First Amendment. What other countries do, and I'll just speak to a couple ideas here. One of them is holding the company that organizes the transmission of the information liable if the information that is transmitted is false or defamatory, right? And so this then leads the industry to regulate itself to make sure that it's not disseminating false or defamatory information. Another idea that the Europeans have embraced is what they call the right to be forgotten. And so if somebody posts something nasty about you online, particularly say a pornographic picture or something, what's sometimes called a revenge porn video, where you take a video of your partner and then they break up with you and then you post online in order to get even with them, an image of them. And the European Union has said very clearly, right, if it's harmful to you, has no public relevance, and is old, you can petition and have it taken down, right? In the United States, if it's online, it's there forever, right? And so that's another, I think, important way in which we could begin to regulate social media. Now, I will be honest with you. The two things I've just mentioned are kind of draining the ocean with a teaspoon measures, right? We need more than this. And so I think what we need to be thinking about, among other things, is on the one hand, so-called media literacy, right? And so really training young people so that they begin to get better at discerning what is true and false in a social media world. Thinking fast and thinking slow, as Daniel Kahneman put it, in a really important way, thinking about what confirms your biases as opposed to what challenges you. But having said all of that, I think it's also the case that ultimately, as long as it remains profitable to circulate false information that confirms our bad beliefs and our self-conceptions, like the idea that white people are not to blame for anything in America and should be the main force in American society, as long as there's profit to be made in that and no negative consequence from disseminating that kind of disinformation, it will continue. And so the other thing that has to happen here is a kind of consumer awareness, and ultimately a demand for accountability, where we boycott social media if they continue to disseminate bad information, so that there is a cost to be paid. That doesn't necessarily require governmental regulation. It requires social regulation of what social media are doing. So John, I want to acknowledge that your question is real and important, right? We got to figure out a way to do this that is compatible with freedom of speech, that doesn't involve the government in regulating one of the major ways in which media is transmitted, but on the other hand is also capable of addressing the problem that so much bad information is circulating in our society at this moment. Bob's put online, given the social dilemma, and I believe you're referring to a documentary or I guess it's actually a docudrama that was put out a while ago. I will confess that I have not seen The Social Dilemma, but he says, given the social dilemma and the tendency to foster affirmation bias, right? That is to say, sometimes it's also called confirmation bias, that we want to get evidence that what we believe is true, right? And so we're much more sensitive to that evidence, right? We pay attention to a rumor of voter fraud here or there, but we don't pay much attention to the evidence that is contrary to what we believe. Affirmation or confirmation bias, which polarizes the populace, suggests that 1/10 of a feed be opposed to that affirmation. Bob, you got to tell me what you mean by the last bit of that. Let's give Bob the last word here. I'm unmuting everyone so Bob can explain that. Bob, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Okay. Number one, you have to watch it. You must watch it. It's a requirement if you're ever going to lecture again.
You're
Anyway.
not the first person to have told me that. The problem is
Okay.
I spend all my time getting ready to lecture, but go ahead.
All right. So the basic premise of that is that these social media companies are gathering all this data, they're selling it to people and so on and so forth. And your feed, what you get to see, is based on all of that information. So there's confirmation or affirmation bias, right?
Right.
My proposal is that, okay, let's simplify it and say, okay, we got a right-wing affirmation bias and we have a left-wing affirmation bias. And so if you're in a right-wing side, we're going to take 10% of the left-wing side and put it in your feed, and conversely, so that you don't get complete biased information. You get a chance, at least, to read something else.
Yeah, so wonderful idea, Bob, and thank you for putting it out there and then explaining it. And I will do my best to watch The Social Dilemma. You're far from the first person to suggest it to me. But having said all that, let me point to the underlying issue that I believe you're referring to, and this is sometimes called the algorithmic architecture of social media. You go on Facebook and you go on Twitter, and it looks like just a random assemblage of posts from friends and families and influencers, but in fact, what you're getting is something that has been carefully curated by artificial intelligence in order to hold your eyes on the screen, because that's the way in which the company that generates that content both gets revenue from the people who advertise on it, but even more importantly, gathers information about you. And that information can be as simple as how long did they spend on that post or that video, because that helps them to generate a profile that is very useful in marketing, right? And so this is what gives rise to this kind of narrowing of the information universe to only things that they think you want to see. And not only that they think you want to see, but that they think you're going to have the right emotional response to. Then that emotional response can be one of liking or being excited by it, or a positive emotional response, but it can also be one of anxiety or anger, because it turns out those negative emotions also keep us very much focused on what's in front of us, right? And so this world of information has been engineered not to get reliable or diverse information, but to get information that keeps you engaged and hopefully, as far as they're concerned, addicted. And that gets in the way of getting good verified information to you. So Bob's suggestion, in short, is that we force the media content providers to change their algorithms to get more diverse or plural information to us. So not everything that we see confirms what we already believe. I think it's a very good suggestion, Bob. Cass Sunstein, who was one of the information people in Barack Obama's presidency, has a similar suggestion in his book, #Republic. All right, so I'm going to leave it there for today. We've started to do some of the good work of trying to brainstorm what regulating social media might look like, some of the problems that might attend it as well. This is stuff we will continue with next week. I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week and hearing the good news that everybody got the vaccination. Remember that you need to have 2 shots before it's really effective, and that takes about a month. So you are on your way, but not out of the woods yet. Take care. See you all next week. Great being with you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
David.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, everybody. Pleasure as always. Bye, guys. Keep up the smart, strong conduct and good questions for me. Bye-bye.